This is Tyler Esselman.
And this is Michael Osinski.
And you are listening to This One Goes to 11.
This One Goes to 11. It is a podcast that Tyler and I have. It's about music, and usually, regularly, we invite someone on to share with us an album that they believe is perfect.
So perfect, in fact, Michael, that 10 out of 10 just isn't good enough.
No siree, Tyler.
No, indeed. No, indeed.
No,
I'm wondering, we've got quite the list of albums that we've listened to thus far. I was dreaming the other day of having a pantheon, having a room in which all of these albums are hanging on the wall, and you can walk in and have a golden record player in the middle and listen to all of the albums in the pantheon.
Well, maybe once we become a super majorly successful podcast and we have our own office, we can adorn the waiting room of our office with the album covers from everything we cover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
We got a good one this week, if I do say so myself. Someone that I know personally. We're talking with Kristen Bonstein. Kristen Bonstein is originally from the great state of New Jersey, has lived in New York City and Boston for 20 years, and recently moved to Western Mass with her husband, 2 kids, and cat. Her day job is in UX content design, and her hobbies include attempting to play various instruments, teaching Pound, a drums-inspired exercise class, baking, drawing, and co-hosting a feminist film club called Strictly Prohibited. And I know Kristen from college because we were both in the theater program at Drew University together.
The New Jersey representation on this podcast is unsurpassed. We have such great Jersey representation. This might as well be a Bruce Springsteen podcast for all the Jerseyans that we have on the pod.
And there's musical artists I'm surprised we haven't covered yet.
Yeah.
But we're checking another big one off the list this week.
This is a big one.
A big, pretty solid major band that I hope most of you have heard of. And if you haven't, then you come to the right place.
You have. Let's not leave them in suspense any longer, Michael. Let's get right to it, shall we?
We shall. Kristen Bonstein, welcome to This One Goes to 11. How you doing?
I'm very well, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad. I have not seen you in forever. Another member of the Drew University squad again on the podcast here.
That's right,
Was it the squad?
Theater kids for life.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Did you have a name for this crew? Did you have some kind of shorthand?
Not the crew, but there was an organization on campus.
Yeah. Has this been discussed in the podcast already?
This has not been discussed, actually.
Oh, okay. So the
great.
Drew University Dramatic Society, aka DUDS. Was like a student-run theater activity group with which Mike and I were heavily involved. And that's basically what brought us together. But yes, Duds for life.
Duds for life. Yeah.
Duds for life.
We should all be so lucky to have some duds in our life.
Very true.
Oh boy. Well, I'm sure we will talk more about our Duds experience. But before we get any further, Kristen, please tell us, what album hath thou brought before the tribunal today?
Well, I have brought 1989's Opus, one of my top bands, and my top album by that band, of course, The Cure's Disintegration.
Dear listeners, I want you to know that the list of albums that Kristen sent us was an embarrassment of riches to choose from.
A who's who. A veritable who's who.
Probably very much of, I guess this is an 80s album, so that's impressive since a lot of my others are straight from the 90s.
But it feels like it's sort of bridging the gap into the
Yeah.
90s, and I'm sure we'll dig into that.
I have many notes about the late 80s into early 90s. Yeah, it is fascinating.
Liminal space there. That
Yep.
It was rich. What do they call that? What do they call that when the spaces when the ocean meets the land and ecosystem blending spaces?
Oh, I don't know.
That.
I did really poor in science class.
There's a biological term for that. Maybe I'll look it up sometime.
Please tell me when you do.
But The Cure might be kind of like that. But we're going to have, for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with The Cure, who the hell are you? And also, just for anybody who wants a little refresher on what the context might be, we have everyone's favorite segment, don't we, Michael?
Yes, it's everyone's favorite segment. Yes, that's what I'm supposed to say here. Okay.
And what's it called?
It is called The Beginner's Guide to the Cure's Disintegration in 60 Seconds.
And I'm doing it today. So this was a feat. A lot of the artists that we have to describe in 60 seconds are a feat, but the Cure was right up there with the most difficult. So we'll see how I do. I'm not trying to be perfect anymore, Kristen. Like, I'm a recovering perfectionist. So that ain't right. Me anymore.
Let's just be humans together.
Life's too short. Life's too short.
Yeah, but before you make your case, Kristen, you get to evaluate Tyler's performance here.
Oh, snap. Okay.
And you can use whatever sort of rubric or scale you want. It can be on a 1 to 10. It can be letter grades. We've had people grade in baked goods, in
Hollywood
colors.
handshakes.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. Am I clarifying question? Am I grading on the quality of Tyler's performance or of like the overall content, or both?
It's all on you.
Okay.
It's all on you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're not going to tell you how to do that.
Yeah.
All right. The library's open. Go for it.
Okay.
All right, okay. Tyler, are you ready?
No, I'm nervous.
Okay. All right, I got 60 seconds on the clock, starting in 3, 2, 1.
So iconic and long-lived a band that their sound has become sewn into the popular rock music vernacular, The Cure is timeless and enduring. One might argue The Cure acts as the umbrella under which the one and only Robert Smith's evolving musical expression has lived. Formed in Crawley, West Sussex in the UK in 1978 as first Malice and then Easy Cure, the first several years of the entity that would become The Cure's existence saw a rotating cast of musical personalities join Smith to greater or lesser degrees of compatibility. After taking on the name of The Cure officially and going on tour with the also legendary Susie and the Banshees, Smith recalls having an epiphany about what sort of sound and presence he wanted to create for the band. This led to the band leaning into the gothic visual and musical style with which they would become closely associated. Smith is famously and unsurprisingly skeptical of titles such as that, but I digress. Disintegration, the band's 8th studio album, is very much in that gothic realm of despondency and gloom, reflecting the state Smith claims to have been in at the time. It was also a massive commercial success for them, charting at number 3 in the UK and number 12 in the US and producing several of their most enduring hits.
All right.
That was close.
That was close.
Yeah.
Excellent. I have no notes.
Really? Okay.
Truly. I mean, they're still, they've gone through so many eras and so many forming and reforming and musical chairing, but I'm seeing them in next month. So,
Which is wild.
Right. Yeah. And I've seen them a couple times before, but I know that whatever they deliver will be, and I'll talk about this more later, like timeless and of a time in a way that's very satisfying to a middle-aged person. But yeah, it's like goth is so reductive, of a genre anyway. I mean, I love pretty much all the bands associated, but especially for The Cure, I feel like, and I always liked that Smith didn't associate himself exclusively with that or, try to box himself in, because they're so much bigger than they are music to me.
Oh,
yeah.
They are music. Okay. You get 2,000 points for they are music to me, but also, so just so we have it for posterity, where would you grade me on my performance if this is about competition?
Oh, okay. So let's see. Keeping it British, let's say out of 5 crumpets, that was a 4.5 crumpets summary. Yep.
Love it. That's
deducting half a crumpet because you didn't fit into 60 seconds, but also because there's so much to fit in that I don't think a 5 crumpet summary is possible.
Totally. That, you know what? This is exactly the energy we want on this one. Goes to 11. Thank you, Kristen.
You're so welcome.
You're taking it seriously.
I am.
And also on Coronation Weekend, no less. Come on.
Oh, well,
I don't give a shit about the
But...
yeah, fuck them.
I'm an Anglophile for, the music and the withering wit, but the royals can fuck off.
I don't give a shit about the monarchy. So, okay, great. So let's transition a little bit to talk about you, though, Kristen. What we like to do before we get into the album itself and your relationship with the album, which is inevitably where we will land, we want to find out a little bit more about what music is to you. I mean, you just said it. They are music to you. This The Cure, but I almost said the Smiths. Okay, that's an interesting thing. The Cure.
I'll allow it.
Yeah. We'll talk about that, though. We'll talk about that. But so how would you characterize your relationship with music on a grand scale, kind of on a life scale? What space does it occupy in your life?
Yeah, this is a big one. Yeah. So try to keep it contained. So when I said they are music, I think there are certain bands that I discovered as I was discovering my taste in music. And so those are foundational for me. But, like most people in the 80s, you grow up listening to whatever is on mainstream radio. And I always liked music, always liked multiple different genres. I think to this day, pretty much everything except what we might classify as like new country, or, Christian rock, perhaps, or both. So I grew up.
There's a lot of overlap there. There's a Venn diagram.
Yeah, there is. And I grew up very adjacent to music and somewhat involved in it. My dad is a self-taught musician, big fan of classical music and folk. I grew up liking those genres as well, but also singing in church choir. I did a lot of musical theater, piano lessons. I was never great at piano, but I did it for 3 or 4 years. And I played church handbells, which if you don't know what that is.
Wait a minute, you and Michael both played handbells then.
I don't know that we've discussed this.
We have never discussed this. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because handbell choir social function is where I discovered Pearl Jam. If you can believe that.
That's amazing. Well, that's so cool. I have a later story about this album that involves a Pearl Jam fan that is also a Cure fan from like 1993. So
hell yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. And like, even though
600 points for handbells.
Totally. And I stopped going to church sometime in high school, but, at least like the ability to read music and to, understand rhythm and things. I'm grateful for my handbell experience. So music was kind of like a hobby. As we've discussed, I'm a theater kid. So I got super deep into theater in high school, college, and up until my mid 20s. So music kind of took a back seat. And I also, in some form, didn't believe I was like talented enough, but I really have been a frustrated musician for most of my life. I also married somebody that has been in bands for 30 years. My husband, Ryan, he went to Berkeley. He can sing amazingly and like play most instruments. So I was just kind of like, well, that's not me.
One of those.
So like you're either that or you're nothing, right? In music, which is just very limiting. So I realized
binary, Kristen.
Yes,
so
I know. Not exactly. Music is a spectrum. So I realized about 10 years ago that I was just gonna I didn't want to learn from Ryan. I didn't want to learn from my dad. I was like, I'm going to sign up for ladies rock camp in Boston and just learn the rock instruments from, a lot of non-men who have been like in underground music scene in Boston. So yeah, I've kind of like dabbled a little bit in all the major instruments, but I have continued somewhat with bass and drums just in my house playing around. And I'm just grateful to have put that self-consciousness aside, even if it's just a hobby.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah. So that was a long answer. It's complicated.
That was amazingly succinct. Let's be real.
Yes, compared to other guests. Yes.
What flavor of church did you go to? Just out of curiosity.
Methodist. And yeah, and
I was raised Catholic, so I'm always like, where's our Venn diagram?
Exactly, yeah, and most people this is in New Jersey and Georgia, and now I'm in Massachusetts, and most people are some flavor of Catholic or lapsed Catholic. Truly, I don't know that much of the differences. I just know that my parents are very progressive on the spectrum, and I knew the Methodist Church split recently over gay marriage, and they're on the right side of that situation, but yeah, I mean the church at the time was kind of a mega church and kind of not awesome that I went to in the late 80s and early 90s.
So we keep seeing this thing about people, people's religious upbringings influencing their musical sensibility, and it's funny to see where there've been churches and synagogues and stuff like that it's so formative for kids and how they understand what music can do and like the ceremonial aspect of it. That's the thing I miss about church music the most.
Yes,
mostly.
Agreed. Yep.
I mean, yeah, like if you're raised Catholic, I mean, Catholic Mass is essentially like a theatrical production. I mean, and you can take that however you choose.
The ceremony, the costumes, the standing and sitting. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a workout.
The fictional stories. Ooh, did I cross a line there? Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen that over the course of our talking to people. So I guess now I'm curious to know, considering how what music meant to you back then, how did you come to discover this album or this band overall?
Yeah, well, The album came out when I was 10, but I didn't discover it until a couple years later. And I'll tell you how, and this may be another through line with other Gen Xers or, late Gen Xers, almost at the millennial cusp. I probably 91-ish, middle schooler, trying to get my hands on as many cassette tapes as I could, especially the ones with the explicit content. Stickers that my parents wouldn't buy for me. Yeah. Oh, I know. Ugh. So I joined Columbia House, which, I guess was very easy to do as a 12-year-old and get
900 points.
Yep. Get a shitload of tapes for 75 cents in the mail with no supervision. And then, of course, you're on the hook for a bunch of other crap. And then you basically quit and start again. So that was Columbia House was my jam for a couple of years. So I would just peruse their I don't even remember if it was a catalog or a brochure. I don't know, some sort of physical media.
It was, it was a big fold out brochure with tiny print, and it wasn't even organized alphabetically. I remember having to search for albums, and you just have to, they'd sort of do it by genre, but they'd also break up bands into different genres. It was very
exactly. I don't remember there being a very clear delineation and telling you what type of music. So I would just evaluate often if I didn't hear on top 40, right? I was I like the name of this album and I like the picture of the album cover. And so that's what I would do. So I was entranced with it was the Staring at the Sea singles from The Cure from, I think it was 86-ish. And so it was just a singles compilation. I didn't know even what that was. I was just oh, there's this craggy old man on the cover and I love the way this looks. And The Cure, that's a cool album sound. So I just ordered it. And then, a year or two after that was when Wish came out, 92. And then that was more of a mainstream, everybody was listening to it. So I ordered that. And then I went to Disintegration was probably the third thing I acquired from them when I got a CD player in 1993. And I thought that was, the height of the future. And so I think by that time I was fully entrenched in the band. I spent all my babysitting money on all their remaining albums up to that point. I don't know. I loved all the different, we talked about this a little bit already, but that they were not boxed into one musical style. They'd already been together at that point, right? So basically since my life, I'm born in 79 and that's when their first album came out. So I always thought that was really cool. And wow, this, I think most kids, when they hear a band, they think, oh, well, these people are 22 and this is the first thing that they've ever done. And most bands that find success have often a decade or more under them. So I was just whoa, they've been making music as long as I've been alive. And, as a theater kid and aspiring young goth in the 90s, I loved just the drama of this unassuming British man who also had full makeup and Edward Scissorhands hair. I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And then I went on to see them in right before my senior year of high school. So 96, I guess. And then I saw them a few years ago in Boston, but Disintegration has definitely remained the album that I go back to the most.
Mm-hmm. Did you fully embrace the goth fashion or basically, because I don't want to, again, we don't want to just limit Robert Smith to being solely goth, but I feel he did sort of inspire or become sort of the figurehead of a subculture. And when you got into the band, did you throw yourself into it completely?
It's a good question. Again, I'm from New Jersey, but my family had moved to Metro Atlanta at this point, and it was, I don't know, the best way I can sum up the aesthetic was kind of 90210. I don't know, everybody was, all the popular kids were blonde cheerleaders and football players. And so anything that wasn't that, wearing a black item of clothing would be considered goth. Mm-hmm. So I think for my high school and, for the suburbs of that time, I was pretty goth. I didn't wear the full costume every day, but definitely by starting in 8th grade, 92, up until I graduated in 97, I wore black more often than not. There was one year that I was I'm only going to wear black and red for some reason. So I would, kind of, but then sometimes I wore rainbow tights and whatever. So I think goth was kind of my, I don't know, I kept going back to it, but sometimes I did full goth and sometimes I just did a little bit of dabbling in goth. And I had a couple friends who were more full goth than me in terms of their musical taste. Because that was another thing in the 90s that I'm sure you all know, right? You couldn't just be oh, I'm not a mainstream person, but I like all of these other underground subgenres. You had to pick, so I couldn't just be like, oh, I really like punk and, college rock and goth and metal, because those groups don't actually talk to each other. They all dress differently. They all interact differently. And I felt that was stupid then. And luckily that's mostly gone away now. But I think in the theater group where I spent the most time, there were probably more kids that would be considered goth than other types of alternative kids, even though I was friends with all of them,
This is a thing that, it's that authenticity thing, right? Like I had a therapist, the best therapist I ever had. Hi, Amber, I love you.
Good therapist.
She was amazing. But she said this thing about millennials, and she said, you millennial, I tell people this all the time. I'm like, Amber said that millennials are obsessed with authenticity. And I'm like, millennials are not obsessed with authenticity. Everybody's always been obsessed with authenticity. Have you seen Singles? Have you seen any of those? Have you seen any of those movies, like from the the grungy movies from the 90s? Like they were always saying like you are real and you're not. You sold
you're
out,
sell out, right? Which I'm very that's very tiresome to me at this point. But it was definitely like a big thing back in the 80s and 90s for sure.
Do you guys feel like it's less now? I kind of feel like maybe the discourse has moved in a different direction from like authenticity. I don't know. There's definitely still the self-help angle of authenticity.
Yeah, I want to hear Mike's thoughts. I have many thoughts.
Well, I think I'm actually about to start reading the book Sell Out by Dan Ozzi, which sort of chronicles a few bands who made the crossover from like independent punk to mainstream labels. And there was something about the 90s as a decade where it's this weird thing of, if you're doing it for the art, as soon as you start making money off of it, you've sold your soul to the devil.
Sure.
Which I can respect the whole anti-capitalist sentiment behind that. But at the same time, it's also like, wouldn't it be great to get paid to do your art? Like, isn't that also kind of a cool thing?
Right.
Gotta eat. Daddy's
exactly.
Gotta eat.
Yeah. And not have to charge, $300 for tickets.
That's another thing.
Yeah. Well,
because that was a whole different landscape for ticket prices and everything. But people bought albums. Yeah.
Sidebarring to that, he was great about, or I think Robert Smith was as great as possible as he could have been about this whole Ticketmaster bloom that happened a couple months ago, whatever you want to call that little bubble. Where people were really kind of biting back about the fees with tickets.
Yeah, I mean,
it is a racket. It's a
right
racket.
Of that, like a band of that magnitude to get tickets for less than $100.
Huge.
It's like unheard of. And of course, I used to go see a bunch of bands for less than $50. Back in the day. So it is really nice to be like, oh, I would love to have seen Madonna, but I'm not going to, by principle, I'm not going to spend $300 on tickets. So. I probably would have still spent a little bit more on The Cure, but I was just so thrilled that they took a stand, and they're still performing in these huge venues. So it can be done.
It can be.
Yeah.
What about your answer to that question, Kristen, about like the authenticity?
Oh boy.
Like how does it live in you now? Do you, because I like, I like an eclectic mix of tastes, so, have you moved away from that?
I think, I also have an 11 and a 13-year-old. So kids that were the age that I was when I was discovering the type of music that I liked, but also, again, in the context of this, like, pick a lane, can't just be a weirdo. You got to be this type of weirdo. I'm not seeing that at all. Like my 8th grade son, Wayne, he's like into sports and really athletic, which that I don't know where that came from, but he's super athletic, and he loves music, and he loves The Cure, and a bunch of his friends, wear Nirvana shirts. And so there's just a lot more. I think when everything became digital, there was less gatekeeping of, and certainly less gender gatekeeping, which is a whole other reason why I never played rock music, is like self-imposed, but also like feeling that vibe from a lot of men in my life that it wasn't for me. So, there were a lot of boys and men growing up who were like explaining these rules of music. And it was like, oh, okay, I didn't realize I wasn't supposed to like punk and metal, who decided that? But I just don't. And again, I'm sure that still exists in some degree because I'm not in middle and high school right now, but I just don't see it. And I see, my kids' friends have completely eclectic taste. A lot of their parents still have similar tastes that I do, and the kids think it's cool. They don't think it's dumb. People going to shows together with their kids. Like we went to Dinosaur Jr., Ryan and I, because they live in our neighborhood basically, but we went to see them in a nearby venue, and it was like this indie venue and, this legendary band, and people our age that were there with their teen kids. And it was and they weren't embarrassed to be there with their parents, and everybody was just like into it. And I was like, wow, I remember having my parents like drop me off at concerts, but I never would have wanted to really be to hang with them and associate our tastes in music. So I do think it's gotten better for sure. And I just don't hear the term sellout that much. There's a really great podcast episode. Oh my gosh, what is it? Decoder Ring. I don't know if you all listen to that. But it's basically about, I'm curious about the book you mentioned, Mike. I just wrote that down, but it sounds like the similar thing. So this Decoder Ring talks about these different pop culture, kind of like mysteries or trends, and it does a deep dive into them. And Sellout was one of them. And so it was a really like tidy 45-minute podcast about the whole history of like that concept of selling out and sort of where we are now in that. So it says a lot of the things that I'm saying better than I am, but Willa Paskin and that podcast, Decoder Ring.
Awesome.
Roll back for a second. You live in the neighborhood with Dinosaur Jr.?
I mean, yes. I definitely live in. So I moved 2 hours west of Boston to Amherst. Probably 2 years ago at this point, after living in Boston and New York for 20 years, and just knowing that there were a lot of musicians out here. Pixies and Dinosaur Jr. started here and still live here, and, catch them from time to time hanging around different places. Their
Very
kids go to the same schools as our kids. But everybody's very chill. And sadly, Sonic Youth, one of my favorite bands, shortly after Kim and Thurston got divorced, Kim stayed here in Amherst or Northampton, I'm not sure which, and but she moved away before we moved here, so I was no Kim Gordon sightings. So there's just like still a ton, and that's why I wanted to be here, because it's not, it's kind of in the woods, but there's also like a ton of really cool music scenes, like past, present, and future, that are going on here, and I really wanted my kids to grow up in that.
Is that considered Western Mass? Is this what people say is Western Mass?
It is. Most people think of like the Berkshires, like, kind of like touching New York State, but it's, I think, pretty much west, between like Worcester and, the western border of the state. So yeah, the Pioneer Valley, we are definitely Western Mass.
10,000 points for Pioneer Valley, the Pioneer Valley hotbed, we'll say. So it seems like there's so much to chew on here, but why don't we give the listeners a little taste of the album itself? Kristen, do you mind telling us what you chose as your standout track from this album?
Definitely. I chose Fascination Street, which is the 7th track out of 12 on this album. Yeah, it was a tough choice, but it was I don't know. When I think about myself playing bass, wanting to play this song, that's like the song that I go back to. It's like this perfect song, but also a song that I like fantasize about actually playing.
Ooh, great. Okay, amazing. We'll talk about it a little bit more on the other side, but everybody, here's Fascination Street by The Cure. See you in a minute. That's the end of part 1. If you access this episode via our YouTube playlist, you're about to hear our guest's standout track. If you'd like to jump ahead to part 2, you'll find a link in the description of this episode.